The paper shook in Letitia Sullivan's hands, not from the dry Arizona wind that slapped at the canvas walls of the land office in Tucson, not from the heat that pressed down on the territory like a boot heel on a man's neck. Her hands shook because the words printed on that document were stealing everything she had left in this world, and the man standing across the rough-hewn counter from her Wallace Prescott was the reason why. "You had no right," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended, which was somehow more devastating than screaming. "No right at all." Wallace Prescott stood with his hat in his hands, turning the brim in slow circles the way a man does when he knows he has done something unforgivable and is still trying to decide if he regrets it. He was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red rock as the canyon walls outside, and his eyes, brown, deep, unreadable, did not flinch when they met hers. "Read the second page," he said. "I have read it. Read it again." The land office clerk, a thin young man named Percy who wore wire spectacles and clearly wished he were somewhere else on this particular Tuesday morning in the spring of 1879, took a half-step backward and found himself pressed against the wall of deed ledgers. The tension in that small room was the kind you could feel on your skin, electric and dangerous, the way the air feels before a lightning strike splits an old oak down its center. Letitia Sullivan did not read it again. She set the paper down on the counter with a steadiness she did not feel, pressed her fingertips flat against it, and looked at Wallace Prescott with eyes that had already seen the worst this territory could offer and had decided they were not done fighting. "The deed has my father's name on it," she said. "Tobias Sullivan. He has been dead for 11 days. I know. And in 11 days you have already arranged to have his land transferred. It was never going to stay yours." Wallace's voice was not unkind, and that almost made it worse. "Territory law is clear. An unmarried woman cannot hold deed to more than 40 acres. Your father's claim is 420. The moment he died without a male heir or a husband in the picture, the clock started ticking. Letitia felt the truth of it land in her chest like a stone dropping into still water. She had known the law. She had always known the law. She had spent the last 11 nights lying awake in her father's house with the smell of his absence still in every corner, going over every possibility, every legal avenue, every man she might trust enough to, and here stood Wallace Prescott, who had beaten her to it. "Who filed?" she asked. "Randall Coombs." The name was a cold knife. Randall Coombs was the largest landowner in the San Pedro Valley, a man who had swallowed up 3 neighboring ranches in the past 2 years through a combination of legal maneuvering, intimidation, and the particular cruelty of a man who understood exactly how power worked and used it without hesitation. He was not a violent man by reputation. He was something worse. He was patient. Letitia pulled in a slow breath. "And where do you come in?" Wallace Prescott set his hat on the counter. He looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between determination and something rower, something he was not yet willing to name. "I come in," he said carefully, "because I am in the same position you are from the other direction. I have land that will be taken if I do not have a wife by the 1st of June, my grandfather's will. It is a condition of inheritance I cannot escape. Judge Harlow is not going to bend on it, and Coombs has already started talking to him about my parcel too." He paused. "I need a wife. You need a deed. Those 2 facts seem to me like they ought to solve each other." The silence that followed was so complete that Percy the clerk could be heard swallowing. Letitia Sullivan looked at Wallace Prescott for a long moment. She was 26 years old, had come to this territory at age 9 with her father, and nothing else after her mother died of fever in Missouri, had helped build the Sullivan homestead plank by plank and fence post by fence post, had learned to shoot a rifle before she learned to properly set a table, and she had spent the last decade watching men use the law the way other men used a pistol, to take what they wanted from people who had less standing to fight back. She had sworn to herself she would never be owned by a piece of paper that called itself a marriage certificate, and now here was this man, offering her the only rope in reach. To understand how she got to this moment, you have to go back 3 weeks. Back to the last Tuesday in March, when her father Tobias Sullivan was still alive, and the world still had its shape. Tobias Sullivan had been 58 years old and built like a draft horse, a broad-shouldered, Irish-born stubborn man who had crossed an ocean and half a continent and carved 40 years of calluses into his palms to own something that was his. He had come to the Arizona Territory in 1870 when Letitia was 17, not 9. She had misremembered the years in her grief, which is the way grief works. And together, they had built the Sullivan Ranch on the banks of a seasonal creek that Tobias had named Mercy Creek, because he said a man needed to name his blessings out loud, or they had a way of slipping past him unacknowledged. Tobias had 420 acres, clear water rights, decent grazing, and a small herd of cattle that was growing in a slow and careful way that suited his temperament. He also had a daughter he was enormously proud of, and a stubborn refusal to discuss the fact that she was unmarried, and that territorial law viewed her existence on that land as provisional at best. Wallace Prescott's land bordered the Sullivan Ranch on the eastern edge, separated by a half-mile of creosote flat and a broken-down fence that Tobias and Wallace's late father, Robert Prescott, had perpetually argued about repairing without either of them ever doing it. Robert Prescott had died 2 years before Tobias, in the winter of 1877, leaving his son Wallace a deed to 600 acres and a will with conditions attached like barbs on wire. The condition was this: Wallace Prescott must be legally married by his 32nd birthday, which fell on the 1st of June, 1879, or the land would revert to the estate of one Chester Prescott, Robert's brother and Wallace's uncle, a man who had moved to Denver and who intended to sell every acre to the first interested buyer. Robert Prescott had believed, with the iron certainty of a man who had built something real and wanted to see it continue, that an unmarried man was an unserious man, and he had written his conviction directly into the language of the deed transfer. Wallace had spent 2 years not especially worried about this condition. He had been 29 when his father died and the will was read, and he had been quietly courting a woman named Clara Holt from the town of Benson, a schoolteacher with red hair and a laugh you could hear from the next street over. He had been moving slowly toward proposing, the way a man moves toward something he feels certain about, without urgency, without drama. And then Clara Holt had fallen in love with the Methodist minister who arrived in Benson in the fall of 1878, and she had married him in December, and Wallace Prescott had found himself in February of 1879, with 4 months left on his grandfather's deadline and no prospects in sight. He had written 2 letters to women in the East through a matrimonial agency in St. Louis and received no replies. He had paid a call to the widow Harriet Devane in Tombstone and found her pleasant enough but so clearly horrified by the isolation of ranch life that he had felt it would be cruel to continue. He had tried not to think about the deadline. Then Tobias Sullivan had died of a heart attack while mending fences on the northwest corner of his property on a Wednesday morning in April, and everything changed. Wallace had found him. He had been riding the fence line himself that morning, looking at the broken posts his father had never fixed, when he saw Tobias lying on his back in the red dirt with his work gloves still on his hands, and the fence wire coiled beside him like it had been set down carefully before the world simply stopped. He had ridden hard to town for the doctor, knowing already it was too late, and then he had ridden to the Sullivan house to tell Letitia, which was the hardest thing he had done in some time. He had met Letitia Sullivan approximately 12 times in his life. Their father's antagonism over the fence had kept the 2 families in a state of polite but distant non-engagement for most of the decade. He knew her by sight, a lean, straight-backed woman with dark auburn hair and gray eyes that seemed to be in a permanent state of careful assessment, as if she was always in the middle of deciding whether you were worth trusting. She wore practical clothes and rode well, and had a reputation in the valley for being the kind of person who fixed her own problems. When he told her about her father, She had stood very still in the doorway of the ranch house for a long moment, her hand flat against the door frame, and she had not cried. She had nodded once slowly, as if she was accepting delivery of something she had known was coming, and then she had said, "Where is he?" And when he told her, she had walked past him to the barn to saddle her horse without another word. He had stood in the yard feeling useless, which was a feeling Wallace Prescott disliked intensely. The funeral was on Saturday. Half the valley came, because Tobias Sullivan had been well liked in the way that direct, honest, quietly generous men tend to be well liked. Wallace stood at the back and watched Letitia receive condolences with a composure that he recognized as the kind of composure that costs something, the kind you build out of necessity rather than ease. After the funeral, he went home and thought about his problem. And then he thought about her problem. And then he rode into Tucson the following Monday to talk to Percy at the land office about territorial inheritance law. And he learned two things: that Randall Coombs had already filed an expression of interest in the Sullivan parcel under the provision that allowed a neighboring landowner to petition for unclaimed land, and that he had a 10-day window before that petition became actionable. He had gone home and thought about it for 2 days, and then he had gone to the land office to file a counterpetition on Letitia Sullivan's behalf, and that was what had brought them both to this moment, her shaking hands, his hat turning on the counter, Percy wishing he had gone into a different profession. "What exactly are you proposing?" Letitia asked. Her voice had gone still and careful in a way that Wallace was beginning to understand meant she was thinking hard and feeling more than she was showing. "A legal marriage," he said. "The terms would be whatever you want them to be. You would have full standing as co-owner of the Prescott land, which would be combined on deed with the Sullivan parcel. You would not be dispossessed. Coombs cannot touch land belonging to a married woman when her husband is the neighboring deed holder. And what do you get out of it besides meeting your grandfather's deadline?" He was quiet for a moment. It was the right question, and he respected her for asking it directly. "I get to keep what my father built," he said. "Same as you." It was the most honest thing he could have said, and she knew it, and the knowing of it made the walls around her decision a little thinner. "I would want my own room," she said. "Of course. I would want it in writing that the Sullivan land remains under joint deed, not solely under your name. I already drafted that language. I have it with me." She looked at him with those gray eyes that were so difficult to read, and he felt something he could not quite name, not quite guilt, not quite hope, something between the two. "I will need to see a full accounting of the combined properties before I agree to anything," she said. "I am not walking into something blind." "That is fair. And I want to meet with the judge myself before the ceremony. I want to hear from his own mouth that this arrangement satisfies the conditions of your grandfather's will." "Also fair." She picked up the document from the counter, folded it precisely, and tucked it into the bag she carried over her shoulder. "I will give you my answer in 3 days," she said. And she walked out of the land office into the Tucson heat, and Wallace Prescott put his hat back on his head and watched her go and felt something shift in the air around him, like the first breath before a weather change. She gave him her answer in 2 days. She sent it with a boy from town, a note folded into thirds on a piece of paper that had been torn from something larger, written in a hand that was firm and even and slightly left slanting. It said, "I will do it. I want to see the deed draft and the letter from Judge Harlow before the end of the week. I need to know that this is a contract and not a trap." He read the last 5 words 4 times. "A contract and not a trap." He wrote back that same afternoon. "Long before this becomes anything else, whatever else it might become, it will always be your choice. I intend to be a man you can trust. I am aware that I have not yet earned that." He sent the letter with the same boy, and then went back to the ranch and stood in the yard in the long afternoon light looking at the fence line that divided his property from hers, the broken posts, and the sagging wire that neither of their fathers had ever fixed, and he made himself a private promise that he would fix it. He was not entirely sure why it felt important, but it did. They were married on a Friday morning in early May, at the courthouse in Tucson, with Percy the land office clerk and a woman named Agnes Dwyer, who ran the dry goods store and was the most reliable witness in the county, standing in as the required parties. Letitia wore her best dress, which was a deep blue cotton with cream buttons, and she had her hair pinned up in a way that Wallace did not remember seeing before. And when she stood beside him in front of Judge Harlow and said the words that the law required, her voice was clear and did not waver. Judge Harlow, a stocky gray-haired man with the demeanor of someone who has spent 30 years watching people make complicated decisions, looked at them both over his spectacles and said, "This is an unusual arrangement to bring before me. The law does not specify what feelings must accompany the legal ceremony," Letitia said. Judge Harlow looked at her for a moment, then looked at Wallace. "She is right," he said, and stamped the document. Wallace signed it. Letitia signed it. Agnes Dwyer witnessed it. Percy, the land office clerk, witnessed it and looked like he was filing the moment away as one of the more memorable of his career. They rode home to the Prescott ranch side by side in the late morning, not talking, the scrub desert opening up around them in every direction, the mountains blue and distant to the north and east, the sky enormous and indifferent the way Arizona sky tends to be. About a mile out of town, Letitia said, "I would like to move my father's cattle to the north pasture of the combined holding. The grazing is better there." "All right," Wallace said. "And the fence line between the two properties will need to come down eventually." "I was already planning on it." She looked at him sideways. "Were you? I started pulling the old posts last week." She didn't say anything to that, but something in her expression shifted slightly, the way a door moves when someone on the other side leans against it. Not open, not even close to open, but not quite as firmly shut. The Prescott Ranch house was a solid adobe structure built by Robert Prescott in the 1860s, 2 stories, with a covered porch running along the front and a kitchen large enough to work in properly, and a room on the second floor that had been used for storage but which Wallace had cleared out and put a real bed and a chest of drawers in before she arrived. He showed her the room without making a production of it, just opened the door and let her look in, and she looked for a moment and said, "Thank you," and he said, "You can change anything in it you want," and that was that. The first week of the marriage was quiet in the way that 2 strangers occupying a shared space are quiet, careful of each other, conscious of every movement and sound, learning the rhythms of a life they had not planned to share. Letitia rose early and went about the work of the ranch with a self-sufficiency that Wallace found both impressive and slightly humbling. She knew cattle. She knew fences. She knew water management and seasonal grazing rotation, and which sections of the land were prone to flooding in the summer rains and which were reliable year-round. She had grown up on this land the same way he had, and she carried the knowledge of it in her hands and her feet and her instincts. He watched her, not obviously the way you watch something you are still trying to understand. They ate dinner together because it was the sensible thing to do, and the first several dinners were polite and somewhat formal, the conversation practical and land-focused. What needed doing? What could wait? The state of the water tank, the condition of the herd, whether the summer rains looked like they were going to come early. On the 5th evening, she asked him about his father. "Your father and mine never got along," she said, not accusatory, just observational, pouring coffee into her cup. "I always wondered why." Wallace leaned back in his chair. The lamp on the table between them was burning low, and the shadows in the corners of the kitchen were deep and soft. "My father thought your father was reckless with water rights," he said, "and your father thought my father was a land hoarder. They were both partly right. That is a more honest answer than I expected. I try not to speak well of dead men just because they are dead." She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup, and something shifted in her expression again, that door moving slightly on its hinges. "My father had a habit of making decisions without consulting me," she said. "He was a good man, but he had a blind spot about what I was capable of." "What were you capable of?" "Running the ranch alone," she said simply. I had been doing it for 2 years before he died. His health was failing and he would not admit it, so the work fell to me. I managed the accounts, the herd, the seasonal labor, all of it. She set her cup down. And then he died, and the law said I could not own what I had built. Wallace was quiet for a moment. The injustice of it sat in the room between them like a third person at the table. I am aware that this arrangement benefits me in ways that are not entirely equal, he said. You are the one who keeps his name on the deed. Your name is on the deed too, because you put it there, which is not the same as the law requiring it. No, he said, it is not. He looked at her steadily. I want you to know that I understand the difference. I'm not asking for gratitude about the deed. I made a practical arrangement that happened to be fair. Those are not the same thing as a gift. She looked at him for a long moment. You are an unusual man, Wallace Prescott. How so? Most men in your position would have told me to be grateful and left it at that. He said nothing to that because there was nothing to say that would not sound like he was proving her point by denying it. The following Sunday, Randall Coombs came to call. He arrived in a good buggy with 2 outriders, and he was dressed well. A large, carefully groomed man in his mid-50s, with the particular confidence of someone who has never had to wonder if he would get what he wanted. He came to the door of the ranch house while Wallace was in the barn and found himself face to face with Letitia, who opened the door herself and stood in the doorway with her arms folded. Mrs. Prescott, he said, which was the first time anyone had called her by that name to her face, and she felt the strangeness of it like a small electric current. I wanted to extend my condolences about your father and my congratulations on the marriage. They do not really belong in the same sentence, she said. Coombs smiled. He had a smile that involved all the muscles of the face without involving the eyes. I had hoped to speak with your husband. I am perfectly capable of receiving guests and conveying messages, she said. What is your business, Mr. Coombs? He looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read but that she interpreted correctly as a man reassessing a situation he had thought he understood. I am interested in purchasing the Sullivan parcel, he said. The eastern 40 acres in particular along the creek. I would be willing to pay a fair price. The Sullivan parcel is not for sale, she said. Any portion of it. I would encourage you and your husband to discuss it. The offer I have in mind is quite generous. Mr. Coombs, she said, with a pleasantness that had an edge like good steel, this is my family's land. I was born on it. I buried my father on it 11 days ago. The answer is no today, and it will be no tomorrow, and it will be no in every future conversation we have about this subject. So I would suggest we save each other time and consider the matter concluded. Coombs looked at her for another moment, that smile not quite as easy now. Good day, Mrs. Prescott, he said, and returned to his buggy. When Wallace came in from the barn and she told him what had happened, he stood in the kitchen with flour on his shirt from where he had been checking the grain storage, and his expression went through several things quickly before settling on something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. You told him no, he said. I told him no several times and in several different ways, she said. I find repetition useful in these situations. Coombs is not used to being told no. That is his problem. Wallace looked at her for a moment. He is going to come back, he said, or he is going to find another angle. Then we will deal with it when he does. The word "we" sat in the air between them for a moment, new feeling, slightly surprising to both of them. Neither of them acknowledged it. That afternoon, Wallace saddled his horse and rode the fence line along the boundary between the combined Sullivan-Prescott holding and the Coombs land, which ran along the southern edge for nearly a mile. The fence was in good repair, which meant Coombs maintained it, which meant Coombs had been paying attention to this boundary for some time. Wallace came home in the evening and sat on the porch in the last light and thought about pressure and patience, and what a man with money and time on his hands could do to a smaller operation if he decided to be methodical about it. He was still sitting there when Letitia came out and sat in the other porch chair with a cup of coffee, and they watched the last of the sun pull itself below the western horizon together without saying much. and it was the first time that sitting quietly beside her felt natural rather than careful. 2 days later, Wallace rode into Benson on ranch business and heard something at the feed store that made his jaw tighten. Coombs had been talking to the Territorial Water Authority about the creek rights attached to the Sullivan parcel, not making a claim, not yet, but asking questions in the pointed way that men with lawyers do when they are laying groundwork. He came home and told Letitia at dinner. She put her fork down and looked at the table for a moment in the focused way she had when she was working through a problem. "The water rights are registered," she said. "They have been since 1872. My father registered them personally in Tucson. I know, but registered rights can still be challenged if there is a question about the validity of the transfer. And is there a question?" Coombs is apparently suggesting that a transfer from a deceased single man to a newly married woman may have procedural gaps. The anger that moved across her face was controlled and fierce in equal measure. "He is inventing procedural gaps," she said. "Yes," Wallace said. "That is generally how this kind of thing works." He looked at her steadily. "I think we need to take this to an attorney, not Percy and not the judge, a proper property attorney in Tucson. That costs money. I know. We have the combined savings from both ranches, but a property dispute of this kind, I can cover it," he said. She looked at him. "This is my fight as much as yours." "Then we split it," he said. "Down the middle, same as the deed." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "Down the middle," she agreed. They rode into Tucson together the following week and spent 2 hours in the offices of a man named Solomon Park, who was a Californian by origin and one of the sharper legal minds in the territory, and who listened to their situation with his hands folded on his desk, and then told them, in straightforward language, that the water rights transfer was clean, and that Coombs would not prevail in a direct legal challenge, but that he might find other ways to make nuisances of himself. "The most effective protection you have," Solomon Park said, looking at them both over his desk, "is exactly what you have already done. Combined deed, joint ownership, registered transfer, documented water rights. You have built a legal structure that is difficult to attack directly. Coombs will look for indirect approaches." "Such as?" Letitia asked. "Disputed grazing boundaries, seasonal access claims, trying to purchase the debt on your cattle loan if you have one." "We have no outstanding cattle loan," Wallace said. "Then he may try to create one. Be careful who you buy supplies from on credit." They rode home in the afternoon sun quieter than they had ridden out, both of them aware that they were in the middle of something larger than a property dispute. Coombs was not going to stop. He had the resources for patience, and patience was its own kind of weapon. "I want to write to my cousin in New Mexico," Letitia said as they rode. "James Sullivan. He is a surveyor and he has contacts with the Territorial Land Office that are different from the ones in Tucson. A second set of registered surveys on the property lines would be useful." "That is a good idea." She looked at him sideways again, that assessing gray gaze. "You do not have to agree with everything I suggest." "I am not agreeing because you suggested it," he said. "I am agreeing because it is a good idea. There is a difference." "Yes," he said, "there is." She seemed to consider this for a moment, then turned back to the road ahead. They rode on. A month passed. In the space of that month, the days settled into a shape neither of them had planned, but both of them could feel themselves growing accustomed to. The ranch work was shared without formal negotiation, divided by inclination and ability in a way that was almost organic. Letitia managed the finances and the cattle and the kitchen garden. Wallace managed the horses, the heavy construction work, and the relationships with the seasonal laborers they hired for the summer grazing push. They argued twice in that month. The first argument was about the barn roof, which needed replacing, and which Letitia thought should wait until fall when lumber prices dropped, and Wallace thought could not wait that long given the look of the summer rain season. It was a practical argument that went in circles for 2 evenings before Letitia went and stood in the barn and looked at the roof herself and came back to the table and said, "You are right, but I want to find a cheaper source for the lumber than Alderman's in town." And Wallace said he knew a man in Bisbee who owed him a favor, and they fixed the roof in July for significantly less than the alderman quote, and both of them knew that they had handled it well, but neither of them said so. The second argument was less practical and more important. It started over something small. Letitia had made a decision about which bulls to sell at the fall auction without discussing it with Wallace first, and he had found out from one of the laborers rather than from her, and it ended in a real conversation about what it meant to make decisions together and what it meant to trust. "I have been making these decisions alone for 2 years," she said, not angry but direct. "It does not occur to me to check with someone else." "I understand that," he said with equal directness, "but we are not alone anymore. That is the point. The point of the marriage is the land," she said, and there it was, the thing neither of them had been saying out loud. Wallace was quiet for a moment. They were in the kitchen, the evening outside the window blue and cooling, the day's work done, a lamp burning between them in the way that lamps had a habit of burning between them in this kitchen, low and warm. "Is that still what this is to you?" he asked. She looked at him, and then, for the first time in the 2 months of their marriage, she did not have a quick answer ready. "I do not know what else it is supposed to be," she said finally. He did not push. He said, "All right," and stood up and carried his cup to the shelf, and she sat at the table in the lamplight and looked at her own hands and felt something uncomfortable and unfamiliar moving through her chest, like a key turning in a lock she had forgotten she had. June became July. The summer rains came, irregular and dramatic, the way Arizona summer rains tend to, great walls of water moving across the valley in the late afternoons, the sky going the color of a bruise before it opened. The creek ran properly for the first time in 2 years. Letitia's cousin James arrived from New Mexico and spent a week surveying the property lines, and was a cheerful, sunburned man of 30, with a fondness for strong coffee and long conversations. And he and Wallace got along well, which surprised Letitia and pleased her in a way she did not examine too carefully. One evening during James's visit, he and Wallace stayed up late on the porch talking, and Letitia lay in her room upstairs listening to the low rumble of their voices and the coyotes somewhere in the distance, and she thought about something James had said to her that afternoon while they were walking the survey line along the creek. He had said, "That is a good man you married, Letitia." She had said, "It is a practical arrangement." And James had given her the look he had been giving her since she was 12 years old, when she said something he thought was foolish. A flat, patient look that conveyed very clearly that he was waiting for her to listen to herself. "I grew up watching my parents," he had said, not pressing, just saying it. "It does not take a particular kind of beginning to get to a particular kind of place." She had not replied, but lying in her room listening to the sound of Wallace's voice below, something she could not quite hear but could feel as a kind of warmth in the floor, she thought, "What kind of place are we going to?" The survey results came back in early August, and James's registered surveys were filed with 2 separate territorial offices, in a redundancy that Solomon Park had recommended, and the documentation on the water rights was strengthened to the point where even Coombs's lawyer in Phoenix, who was by all accounts a clever man, could not find a clean angle on it. Coombs himself sent a letter in mid-August. It was polite, formal, and contained a purchase offer for the entire combined Sullivan Prescott holding at a price that was objectively insulting. Letitia read the letter at the kitchen table, then passed it to Wallace without comment. He read it, looked up at her and said, "No." "Obviously no," she said. "I will write back." "Let me," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "All right." She wrote a letter that was 2 sentences long. "The property is not for sale at any price. Please consider this our final response on the subject." She signed it, Letitia and Wallace Prescott. She had signed things, Letitia Prescott, before legal documents, land filings, but this was the first time she had written both their names together as a unit, a we, a shared position, and she sat looking at it for a moment before folding the letter. She sealed it and handed it to Wallace, and he sent it with the post rider that afternoon. That evening, they ate dinner later than usual because a fence on the eastern pasture had come down in an afternoon storm, and they had both spent 2 hours in the rain getting it back up, and they came inside wet and cold for August, which happens in Arizona when the rain comes in hard off the mountains. And Letitia made coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in, and they sat across from each other in the familiar lamplight and drank it. "You have calluses on your hands," she said. She was not sure why she said it. It had come out before she decided to say it. Wallace looked at his hands, then at her. "Ranch work," he said. "I know," she said. Your father's hands looked like that. Mine look like that." She paused. "I suppose I was thinking that some things do not change regardless of circumstances." "Some things should not have to change," he said quietly. She looked at him. The lamp was low between them, the rain still tapping at the window glass, and in the warm light his face was open in a way she had not seen it be before, something behind the usual steadiness showing through. "I told James this was a practical arrangement," she said. "I know," he said. "I heard him tell you he thought I was a good man." Her face did something quick and involuntary. "You heard that. Sound carries on a quiet evening." She looked down at her coffee cup for a moment. "Is it still just practical to you?" she asked, which was the question she had not let herself ask before. He was quiet for long enough that she looked up. "It stopped being just practical to me sometime in June," he said. "I was not going to say anything because I did not think you were ready to hear it." She felt the words land, felt the weight of them, felt the particular vulnerability of someone who has been handed something true and is not sure yet what to do with it. "I am not certain I am ready now," she said honestly. "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to be." She looked at him. "You are the most patient man I have ever met." "I have a vested interest in the outcome," he said. And there was something in his voice then, not quite humor, not quite sorrow, something that held both at once. She laughed. It was short and a little surprised, a real laugh, and it changed the atmosphere of the room the way opening a window changes a room. And Wallace Prescott looked at her laughing in the lamplight in their kitchen and felt something that was simply happiness, clean and complete, the kind you do not second guess. She stopped laughing and they looked at each other. "I think," she said carefully, "that I may have been feeling things I have been calling practical because practical felt safer." "What would you call them if you were being honest?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. The rain was softer now, almost stopped. The lamp was burning down. Outside the window, the first frog of the evening was starting up in the wet grass. "I would call them something I want to understand better before I name them out loud," she said. "Is that enough for now?" "It is more than enough," he said. They went to their separate rooms that night, and Letitia lay awake for a long time in the dark, not unhappily, listening to the quiet house and thinking about doors and what it means to choose to open one. September arrived with a change in the air, the heat finally releasing its grip on the valley in the afternoons, the mornings cool enough for a jacket, the light going golden and long in the evenings. The ranch was in good shape. The cattle were healthy, the water was running, the hay was cut and stored, the books balanced with a small surplus that Letitia had managed by meticulous attention to costs that still impressed Wallace when he went over the accounts. One afternoon in the first week of September, they were riding together along the northern pasture boundary when Letitia's horse spooked at a jackrabbit and she kept her seat beautifully, easy and automatic, and Wallace had already reached across the space between them before he thought about it, his hand going to her arm the way a hand does when the body reacts before the mind has a chance to make decisions. She looked at his hand on her arm, then up at him. He pulled his hand back. "Sorry," he said. "Don't be," she said. They held each other's gaze for a moment, both of them on horseback in the long September light, the valley spread out below them in every shade of gold and red and olive, the mountains blue in the distance, the whole enormous sky above them carrying nothing but open possibility. "I think," Letitia said, "that the word I have been looking for is love." The words arrived quietly, without fanfare, the way the truest things do, and Wallace felt them settle into the place in his chest that had been waiting for them without his realizing it. "I think I knew what I was looking for before I knew what to call it," he said. She looked at him with those gray eyes that had been assessing him for 6 months and had apparently reached a verdict. "I would like you to stop sleeping in the other room," she said. "When you are ready," he said. "I am telling you I am ready," she said, with that directness that was so completely and entirely her, and he looked at her and smiled, which was a thing she realized she had not seen him do fully and openly before. And it was something remarkable, that smile. It changed the whole landscape of his face. They rode home slowly in the September evening, their horses side by side, close enough that their knees nearly touched, talking about nothing in particular, or talking about everything in the way that people talk when they have found the person they intend to talk to for a long time. The night that followed was gentle and honest and private, and when Letitia woke the following morning in the pale early light, she lay still for a moment, feeling the solid warmth beside her and the quiet of the house around her, and something she recognized, after a moment's consideration, as the feeling of being in the right place. In October, Coombs made one more move. He had apparently been building a case, through his lawyer in Phoenix, that the combined deed transfer from the Sullivan estate to the Prescott property had been executed improperly because of the timing relative to the marriage certificate. The argument was technical and specific, and turned on a 14-day window between Tobias Sullivan's death and the marriage filing, a window in which Coombs claimed the Sullivan property had briefly been in an unclaimed state. Solomon Park wrote them a letter in the first week of October laying out the argument and his rebuttal, which was substantial and well documented, but which would require a hearing before a territorial judge, and not Judge Harlow, who had performed the marriage ceremony, and was therefore a conflict of interest, but a visiting judge from the circuit court who was scheduled to come through Tucson in November. They spent the 3 weeks before the hearing gathering documents, riding into Tucson twice to meet with Solomon Park, and generally living with the low-grade weight of something unresolved hanging over everything. Letitia did not let it make her anxious in any visible way, but Wallace noticed she slept less well, and she noticed that he worked longer hours on the ranch as a way of managing his own restlessness, and they talked about it openly, which was something they had both gotten better at. "If Coombs wins this," she said one evening, and she said it plainly, not catastrophizing, just preparing, "what is our best position?" If Coombs wins on the technicality, the most likely outcome is that the original Sullivan water rights revert to an unclaimed state for the 14-day period, which means they would be subject to a renewed claim. But our claim would be prior and documented, and we would refile immediately. He would contest the refiling. Yes, and we would win the contest, but it would take time and money. She was quiet for a moment. "I will not let him have my father's creek," she said, not dramatic, just definitive. "He is not going to get it," Wallace said. She looked at him. "You sound very certain." "Solomon Park has not lost a water rights case in 7 years, he said. "And Coombs's argument has a fundamental flaw in it. The 14-day window he is claiming existed was not a period in which the property was unclaimed. It was a period in which it was in a state transition. Those are legally distinct. Harlow knows it. The circuit judge is going to know it." She studied him for a moment. "When did you learn enough about territorial property law to say that with confidence?" "I have been reading," he said. "Reading what?" "Legal texts. Land case precedents from California and New Mexico. I borrowed Solomon Park's copies." She looked at him with an expression he was learning to read as the one she wore when he had surprised her in a way she found she did not mind. "You have been educating yourself on territorial land law," she said. "I have a vested interest," he said, using the phrase that had made her laugh in August, and she gave him a look that said she remembered it. The hearing was held on a Wednesday in November, in the territorial courthouse in Tucson, before a circuit judge named Arthur Finch, who had the dry, precise manner of a man who had spent 30 years distinguishing between relevant and irrelevant arguments, and had very little patience for the latter. Solomon Park was methodical and effective. Coombs's lawyer from Phoenix, a sharp-featured man named Dill, was eloquent but was ultimately arguing from a position that had, as Wallace had said, a fundamental flaw in it. The estate transition documentation was clean. The 14-day period was demonstrably not an unclaimed period. The water rights registration predated any claim Coombs could make by 7 years. Judge Finch deliberated for 2 hours, which was shorter than the 3 Solomon Park had warned them to expect, and delivered a ruling that upheld the combined deed transfer and the water rights registration in their entirety. Coombs sat in the gallery and his face showed nothing, which was the face of a man filing the loss away for future reference. His lawyer leaned over and said something to him in a low voice. Coombs nodded once and stood and left the courthouse without looking at them. Outside on the courthouse steps in the November sun, which was warm and brilliant in the way Arizona November sun is, Letitia stood for a moment with her eyes closed, her face tipped up toward the light. Wallace stood beside her and waited. After a moment she opened her eyes and looked at him, and what was in her face was relief and triumph and something deeper than both, something that had been building since a day in April when he had found her father on the ground and a day in May when a land office paper had shaken in her hands. "We are not done," she said. "He will try again." "Probably," Wallace said, "but not on this ground, and each time he fails the legal record gets stronger. He will find a new angle eventually. Then we will deal with it." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she took his hand, standing on the courthouse steps in the November Tucson sun with Agnes Dwyer watching from the buggy and Solomon Park saying something cheerful about lunch, and she took his hand the way you take something you have decided belongs to you, firmly and without apology. "You said you intended to be a man I could trust," she said. "I want you to know that I do." His hand closed around hers. "That means more to me than the ruling," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder briefly, just for a moment, and then straightened up again because she was Letitia Sullivan and she did not lean on people for long. But it was enough. They celebrated with lunch at the best restaurant in Tucson, which was a place that served beefsteak and pie and had tablecloths that had been washed recently. And they ate enormously and talked about entirely non-legal things for the first time in 3 weeks. And Solomon Park was excellent company, and Agnes Dwyer told them about the time she had taken Coombs to task in her dry goods store for trying to return a bolt of fabric after using half of it. And the story was so good that they were still laughing about it on the ride home. They arrived home in the late afternoon, and the ranch was exactly as they had left it, solid and real and theirs, the adobe walls warm in the setting sun, the horses in the pasture, the creek running silver in the low light, the smell of the desert in the cooling air, sage and creosote, and the faint sweetness of the blooming acacia along the fence line. "Home," Letitia said, not to anyone in particular, just saying it out loud the way her father had said his blessings out loud, acknowledging the thing so it could not slip past unacknowledged. Wallace looked at her in the fading light. He thought about saying something. He decided that some moments were better left whole. He reached for her hand again, and she gave it to him, and they stood in the yard of the ranch they had built between them, on land that was theirs because they had fought for it, and because they had chosen each other, which were not as different things as they had once seemed. November moved toward December, and with December came the cold that the high desert does properly, frost on the grass in the mornings, the mountains to the east carrying snow on their peaks, the nights long and brilliant with stars. It was a season for fires and close rooms and conversation, and Wallace and Letitia had both of those things in abundance. Their life together had settled into something they had not planned and could not have predicted from the vantage point of that land office on a Tuesday morning in April with a paper shaking between them. They had built it the way Tobias Sullivan had built his ranch, piece by piece, out of the available materials, and it had the quality that things built that way tend to have, which is a solidity that comes not from perfection but from honesty. They argued still, occasionally, over practical things and sometimes over impractical things, And the arguments were clean and ended cleanly, because both of them had a preference for resolving what was between them rather than carrying it. Letitia was still direct to the point of bluntness and had a stubbornness about her judgment that sometimes required Wallace to simply wait her out, and Wallace had a reticence about expressing uncertainty that sometimes required Letitia to ask him directly what he was not saying. They had learned each other's angles. They laughed, which they had both somewhat surprised themselves by doing. Wallace had a dry, quiet sense of humor that came out sideways in the middle of serious conversations, and Letitia had a sharp wit that she had apparently been keeping in reserve for years, waiting for someone who could keep up with it. In December, they had 2 dinners at neighboring ranchers' homes and found that people looked at them together in a way that said, "Yes, this makes sense," which was a thing you did not expect when you married for practical reasons in a land office with a nervous clerk as your witness. And yet, the sense that they had always been pointed at each other, retroactively, was a feeling that other people could apparently see from the outside before either of them had been able to see it from the inside. "People keep telling me what a good match we are," Wallace said one evening, standing at the kitchen shelf with his back to her, which was a thing he did when he was saying something he was not entirely certain how it would land. "And does that surprise you?" she asked. He turned around and looked at her. "A little," he said. "In May I would have said the odds of it were against us." "In May I would have said the odds of everything were against me," she said. "I have learned to have a different relationship with odds." "You mean you have learned to ignore them?" "I mean I have learned that odds are invented by people who have already decided the outcome, and that the actual territory is wider than any map they have drawn of it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Letitia," he said, and the way he said her name had a quality it had acquired somewhere in the past several months, a particular warmth that made it sound different from the way anyone else said it. "I love you. I am aware you may already know that, but I want to make a habit of saying it out loud." She looked back at him with those gray eyes that had assessed everything from the beginning and had arrived definitively at him. "I love you," she said. "I have for longer than I admitted it, even to myself." He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she let herself be held, which was a thing she had been learning to do, finding that it cost her less than she had once feared and gave her more than she had expected. She rested her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, which was steady and real, and felt the particular quality of safety that comes not from being protected but from being known. Outside, the December stars were enormous over the Arizona desert, and somewhere on the far side of the property, Mercy Creek ran on in the dark, named for a man who had believed in naming blessings out loud. Spring came again. The first spring of their marriage had been an emergency, a scramble, a series of legal and practical crises threaded between 2 people who were strangers to each other. This spring was different. This spring was theirs. The winter had been quiet in the way that earned quiet is, the result of good preparation and careful work, and they came out of it with the ranch in strong condition, and with a relationship that had deepened in the long dark evenings of December and January into something both of them recognized as permanent. Not the performance of permanence, but the thing itself. In February, Letitia told Wallace that she was going to have a child. She told him in the morning at the kitchen table over coffee, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions that moved from surprise to something so open and simple that she found herself having to blink. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the first thing he asked was about her, which she noted. "I am very well," she said. "I wanted to tell you before I started planning around it." He reached across the table and took her hand. He looked at her steadily, and what was in his face was joy and something that looked like the kind of seriousness that joy sometimes brings, an awareness of the weight of good things. "We are going to have a child," he said, as if saying it made it more real. "We are," she said. "In September, I think." They sat with that for a moment, the morning light coming through the kitchen window, the coffee cooling between them, the world outside beginning its spring unfurl of green and gold. The months that followed had the quality of both ordinary time and heightened time, the simultaneity of a life going on as it always does while also becoming something larger. The ranch work continued. The legal situation with Coombs had been quiet since the November ruling. Solomon Park had written to say that Coombs had apparently turned his attention to a property dispute elsewhere in the county, which was a relief without being a certainty. Letitia's cousin James visited again in April and helped build an addition to the house, a proper room adjacent to the main bedroom that had more light and better ventilation, because James Sullivan was a practical man who knew what an expanding family needed. Wallace had never built anything for a child before and approached the task with a focus that Letitia found both touching and mildly amusing. He spent 3 evenings reading what little there was to read on the subject in the books they owned, and he asked Letitia's opinion on every decision, which she appreciated and occasionally needed to rein in because some of his questions were so specific as to reveal that he was managing his happiness through attention to small details. "The windowsill will be fine," she told him one evening. "I want to make sure the wood is smooth enough," he said. "It is smooth enough. I could sand it again." "Wallace," she said, with the particular affectionate exasperation that had become one of her characteristic modes with him, "the windowsill is perfect. You have sanded it 3 times." He looked at the windowsill. "It could be better," he said, and she laughed, and he looked at her laughing and smiled in that way of his that she had been seeing since September and that never entirely failed to do something to her. "Are you nervous?" she asked. He considered it honestly, which was a habit of his she valued. "Yes," he said. "I want to do it right." "You are going to be wonderful," she said, and she said it without hesitation because she believed it fully, and he looked at her with the kind of expression that meant she had said exactly the right thing. The summer passed, richer and more eventful than the previous one, not because of external crises, but because of the fullness of a life that had found its shape. There were meals and work and laughter and disagreements resolved and evenings on the porch watching the summer storms roll across the valley. And throughout it all Letitia felt her body changing and the world becoming simultaneously more fragile and more solid, which was a paradox that made sense to her in a way it might not have before. On an evening in late August, the kind of Arizona evening where the heat finally breaks and the air smells of rain and sage and something clean, Letitia sat on the porch and watched the last light go out over the western mountains and felt, for the first time since April of the previous year when everything had seemed to be ending, that everything was instead beginning. Wallace came out and sat beside her, and she reached for his hand without looking, finding it by habit and knowledge. "I was thinking about my father today," she said. "Good thoughts or hard ones?" "Both," she said. "I was thinking that he would have liked you, despite the fence business." "Because of the fence business," Wallace said. "He would have said any man willing to fight over a fence line is a man who cares about his land." She smiled. "He would have said exactly that." She paused. "I was also thinking that he named this creek Mercy Creek because he said a man needed to name his blessings out loud. I remember you told me that." "I want to do that," she said. "Name them out loud." He looked at her. The evening was going purple and quiet around them, the first star appearing in the east over the mountains. "Then do it," he said softly. She looked out over the land, their land, the long sweep of it in the evening light, Mercy Creek catching the last of the sun in the middle distance. "This land," she said. "This marriage, this life." She turned and looked at him fully. "You." His hand tightened on hers. "You," he said back. Their son was born on the 1st of September, 1880, in the room that James had helped build in the care of the midwife from Benson, who was a calm and competent woman named Vera. It was a difficult birth, as many are, and there were several hours in the middle of the night when Letitia found resources in herself that she had not known the depth of, and Wallace sat in the kitchen below and had what were probably the longest hours of his life. And then Vera came down the stairs just before dawn and said the words he had been waiting for. They named him Tobias Robert Prescott, for the fathers they had both lost, and he was a solid, loud, clear-eyed infant who seemed from the first hours of his life to be paying very close attention to everything around him, which Wallace said was clearly a Letitia quality, and Letitia said was clearly a Wallace quality, and they were both right. Winter came, softer than the one before, and they moved through it with a new shape to the household, the particular reconfiguration of two people becoming three, the adjustments and the sleepless nights and the unexpected graces of an infant who, at 6 weeks, produced his first real smile while Letitia was talking to him in the kitchen light, and who, at 4 months, had figured out that making noise got Wallace to come running, and who, at 6 months, was being carried on Wallace's back while Wallace mended fences, and apparently finding the rhythmic motion to be the most satisfying thing in the world. In the spring of 1881, a second letter arrived from Solomon Park. Not about Coombs. Coombs had resolved his other property dispute, and had, by all accounts, turned his ambitions to a piece of land near Tombstone that had nothing to do with the San Pedro Valley. The letter was about a different matter entirely, a provision of the new territorial regulations that allowed co-owners of a combined deed to formally register the combination as a single consolidated holding, which would simplify their legal position and reduce the ongoing vulnerability to challenges. They rode to Tucson in April to complete the paperwork. Tobias came with them, strapped into a carrier on Letitia's front, wide-eyed at the city and very interested in the horses on the main street. Percy at the land office was still there, still wearing his wire spectacles, and he looked up when they came in and recognized them immediately, and his expression did something warm and surprised. "Mr. and Mrs. Prescott," he said, "and I see things have progressed since I last saw you." "They have," Letitia said. Percy looked at the baby, who looked back at him with serious eyes, and then looked at the two of them, and something in his expression was the expression of a man who had witnessed the beginning of something and was glad to see where it went. They signed the consolidation documents together, side by side at the counter, their signatures below each other in the deed ledger, Letitia and Wallace Prescott, and it was a simple administrative act and also a complete thing, a full circle from the day 15 months earlier when Letitia's hands had shaken over a piece of paper in this same room. She did not shake now. She pressed her signature onto the page with the firm, even hand of a woman who knew what she owned and what she had built, and who she had built it with. Outside in the April Tucson sun, Tobias had fallen asleep against her chest, warm and trusting, and the street was busy with the ordinary life of a frontier town in a territory that was still becoming itself, and the mountains were blue in every direction, and the sky was the particular impossible blue it is in Arizona in April, the kind that makes you understand why people came here across impossible distances and stayed. Wallace stood beside her and squinted at the sky. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am thinking about the fence," he said. She looked at him. "The last section between the north pasture and the original Sullivan boundary," he said. "I want to take it all the way down this summer. There is no line there anymore, and I want the land to reflect that." She looked at the mountains for a moment. "Take it down," she said. "I will help." He smiled that smile of his, the one that changed the whole landscape of his face, and she reached over and tucked her arm through his, the baby sleeping between them in the noon sun, and they stood in the street of a frontier city in a territory that was still finding its law and its shape, and they were, in every sense that mattered, exactly where they were supposed to be. The land was theirs. They had fought for it with lawyers and letters, and the particular stubbornness of people who understood what the ground beneath them meant. They had married for practical reasons, and loved each other beyond them. They had named their blessings out loud on the porch in the evening light, and the creek ran on through the middle of their land carrying its name with it. 3 years after that April in the land office, the valley had changed in the way places change when good people stay in them and build carefully. 2 more neighboring families had been threatened by Coombs's expansions and had come to Wallace and Letitia for advice, and they had spent several months helping them navigate the legal landscape, because they had the experience and the documentation, and because Letitia understood with clarity what it meant to stand in a land office with a paper shaking in your hands and no one in your corner. Coombs never did attempt a direct move on their property again. He moved his operations further east, toward Tombstone, where the silver boom was making everyone greedy and reckless, and he apparently met his match in a mining company lawyer who was even more methodical than he was. The last they heard of him, in a letter from James in 1882, he had lost a significant claim to a legal challenge that bore a notable resemblance. Solomon Park wrote in an amused addendum to the argument that had preserved the Prescott holding. In the spring of 1883, Letitia told Wallace she was expecting again. This time he was not nervous in the same way. He was tender and attentive and occasionally still too focused on windowsills, but the groundwork of fear had been replaced by the groundwork of confidence, the knowledge that they had done this before and done it well, and that whatever the next season brought, they would meet it as they had met everything else, together and without apology. Their second child, born in October of 1883, was a girl. They named her Catherine for no one specific, just because the name had a sound that pleased both of them, a name that felt like something solid and clear, which seemed appropriate. Tobias, who was 3 by then and had Wallace's steadiness and Letitia's observant gray eyes, approached his new sister with a gravity that made both his parents try not to smile, studying her with the careful focus of someone cataloging important information. He called her Cat from the beginning and continued to do so, and eventually everyone did. The house was fuller now, and louder, and there were mornings when the combination of 2 small people and ranch life, and the ongoing business of a working property, left both Wallace and Letitia sitting in the kitchen in the evening, with the particular exhaustion of people who are busy with good things. On one such evening, late in the fall of 1883, the children asleep and the house quiet and the desert outside the windows holding its night sounds, Letitia sat at the kitchen table with the ranch accounts while Wallace read beside the lamp, and she put her pen down and looked at the room around her. It was the room where they had eaten their first formal dinners as strangers, where they had argued about the barn roof, where she had laughed for the first time in this house, and where they had sat in the rain-cooled aftermath of a summer storm and said the truest things, where Tobias had taken his first uncertain steps holding both their hands, one on each side like a small person crossing a difficult ford with good guides, where Catherine had slept in her basket while the house moved around her, new and assured of her welcome. "What are you doing?" Wallace asked, noticing her stillness. "Naming blessings," she said. He looked at her over the book. His face was older than it had been in the land office, which was only natural, 3.5 years older, weathered a bit more by sun and work and life, which was also only natural, and she could see in it every version of him she had learned in that time. The careful stranger and the patient man and the honest argument and the full open smile, and the father standing in the pasture with their son on his back, and the husband in the lamplight saying words that had changed what she thought was possible. "Say them out loud," he said, which was what she had said to him that evening on the porch with the first star appearing. She looked at him and smiled and said, "You are at the top of the list," and he set down his book. The lamp burned low between them, and outside Mercy Creek ran on in the dark through the middle of a land that was fully and completely theirs, one not by luck or grace or the accident of birth, but by the decision to stand their ground, both of them, side by side, in a territory that was still becoming itself, on land that they had named with their names and filled with their life, and they sat together in the warm kitchen in the November quiet and found, as they always had, that being known by another person is the most significant territory any life can claim. The fence between the 2 original properties was long gone. The creek was theirs. The deed was clean and consolidated and registered in 2 territorial offices and in the permanent legal record of a territory that would, in 9 years, become a state, carrying the names of all the people who had fought to stay on its land and make it mean something. On the deed, as on everything that mattered in this life, the names read together, Letitia and Wallace Prescott. And that was exactly right. And that was exactly enough.